Hello, y'all. Welcome to this online adult elective class. We've been going through biblical categories for reading Paul. In last class, we talked about the foundational category through which the rest of the four remaining categories are an expression of or an overflow from, and that was love, right? Everything Paul does, thinks, and says about God is who God is revealed in Jesus Christ as the God of love, the God who loves us. And so today we're going to be looking at grace or gift giving, which the Greek word, the expression is charis. And like I said, what I'm doing is I'm pulling from this book. It's Douglas Campbell, Pauline Dogmatics. Highly recommend it. It's been super formative for me. So all I'm doing is distilling a couple of chapters in here for y'all that have been helpful for me while I read Paul. So hopefully it's helpful to you. And I'm also pulling from, and so is he, from a foundational work. It's called Paul and the Gift by John Barclay. And this book is the foundational book for talking about grace and gift giving in ancient societies and modern societies. It's just whenever you want to talk about grace, you can't move on without reading this book first. So we're pulling from this as well. And so before I begin, it's important to say that the concept of grace isn't unique to Paul. Grace, or the idea of gift giving, is a anthropological thing. Societies throughout history have been binding to each other, right? Societies form and bind to each other outside of kin, immediate blood relatives, through gift giving. And so Dr. Barclay gives us as broad of a definition as you could get with this very complex and controversial topic as grace or gift. And he says grace should be viewed as gift. And I'll read this definition and then we'll kind of break it down. So gift is a sphere of voluntary personal relations that are characterized by goodwill in the giving of some benefit or favor, and that elicits some form of reciprocal return that is both voluntary and necessary for the continuation of the relationship. And so quickly, a gift is voluntary. That means the person chooses it. I choose it in my free will to initiate the act of giving gifts. And the gift and this act moves beyond itself. So it's not just gift giving for the sake of giving gifts, like we're all Santa Claus, but it's supposed to create relationships, some sort of relationship with another person, again, outside of your household, outside of your kin, because there's other tribes, there's other people, and you need to connect with them somehow. So you do it through the form of gift giving. Thus, it creates goodwill, right? If someone brings me a gift, instead of coming to me to fight me or stab me, I'll more likely trust that person because they first initiated this gift. Now there's goodwill, I trust them, now a relationship can begin. And so the gift could be a benefit or a favor, it could be an actual thing, or it could be a service of some sort, something that helps another person where they didn't have help before or couldn't have it before. And so this gift giving and this relationship building elicits, not demands. So it's not like, here, I'm going to give you this, and in 5 days you better give me something of equal value or more. It's kind of like in the air. You know, people understood that to give gifts, nowadays when we think of a perfect gift, we think it's a linear thing. I give it with no expectations whatsoever. Well, that's a modern construct. Gift giving always elicited expectations, right? There's always, you give, and if you receive, you also give back, and it's supposed to be ongoing. That's how a relationship goes. And so it elicits this return of favor, gift, benefit of some sort that is also voluntary. So I choose to initiate gift, you choose to return. and basically your choice to return is a choice to continue in this personal relationship. And it's ultimately for the continuation of the relationship. So we'll go through this in a little bit, but the gift, the person initiating starts a relationship. The person who receives the gift then chooses to continue this relationship, and the way, or to accept this relationship, and the way to continue the relationship is by reciprocating the gift, and vice versa. So it's an ongoing thing. The relationship keeps going. Unless the gift giving stops, then the relationship can be terminated. So we spend some time on that because it's really important to grasp this idea of gift. Because Paul wasn't talking in a void, right? He had his own theological views of the language of gift or grace that he was speaking into their idea of gift and grace, right? Because remember, he's a man in two worlds, Jewish world and pagan, Gentile, Greco-Roman world. And he's not trying to like pour one culture into another, right? But what he's doing is he's working with God categories. Because, right, Jesus revealed himself, apocalypsed himself. Apocalypse means reveal, to Paul, which changed the way he thought about everything, both in his Jewish world and in the pagan world. That's what made him the perfect candidate for apostle of the Gentiles. And so this language of grace, it is important in Paul. He opens up almost all of his letters with this grace wish. Grace to you, peace to you from God our Father. And he'll sometimes close his letters with the same grace wish. For example, 2 Thessalonians ends, this is chapter 3, verse 17. He says, I, Paul, am writing this greeting with my own hand. So we know that's legitimate, which is an authenticating mark in every letter. This is how I write. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. So if this is how Paul writes, this is how we authenticate him, then we should probably understand grace, right? We hear it all the time, and we have our ideas based off of what our culture has instilled in us. But if Paul is using it all the time, right, it's how he's authentic. That means he's revealing God authentically through this language. So we should probably get a grasp of what he's doing with it. And so the question we're asking is, what was Paul trying to convey theologically to his Gentile converts, remember, apostle to the Gentiles, about the God revealed in Jesus Christ? Because they have a language, a concept of grace, gift, but God reveals the true concept of grace, gift, rooted in love. We'll get to that. And so how does he speak into this, right? Without just giving completely alien concepts, right? The method he uses is contextualization. And that just means to take a concept, conform it, reform it, and transform it ultimately to show truth. So grace language is part of the complex ancient Greco-Roman practice called patronage. And so this is where the wealthy elites of the city would freely fund building projects and be benefactors. A benefactor is someone who gives a benefit over complex networks or relationships of clients. But these benefactions or benefits or funds are not freely given, actually, because every gift in the ancient Greco-Roman world had strings of expectations tied to them. And so if you receive the gift from a benefactor, then you become their client. Thus, a patron-client relationship begins if you receive it. And what tied all this together was status. Status was your lifeline within an honor-shame culture like that of the ancient Greco-Roman world. So it's self-motivated, it's self-ambitious, it's selfish, the desire to fund things, right? Yeah, you could I'll pay to build that building or that temple or that school, whatever, but put my name on it. Or, yeah, I'll give you a gift, but serve me, right? Be one of my many servants, many clients. The more clients you have, I mean, nowadays, right? Think of a law firm. A law firm is super successful the more clients they get, right? And that's the case for anything. And so this benefaction was a way for the wealthy elites to build their status and to maintain their status. And then a person, a client, accepts it and keeps the relationship going to maintain their status and in hopes of one day building their own status. So Paul is taking these ideas, taking these languages and transforming them to speak about God, right? Because grace and the true gift, which is Jesus Christ, that's the true gift, and the ultimate gracious giver is God. And so these were ideas as well. There were religious connotations of speaking of deities, gods, as givers. But just like, and we'll get more into this later, but just like the pagan way of giving, it was self-motivated and it was partial and limited. And so that was projected onto the gods. They worked just like the elites in the city, partial, measuring parts. And so Paul takes this language and he's speaking God's grace into it. And he's revealing who God is through this language of grace. Doug Campbell says it this way: Paul is drawing on language familiar to the unschooled pagan converts to express important truths. So this idea of grace, gift, denotes two closely related things. One, a gift or a benefaction, and two, the generous disposition of the giver, which is usually a superior. So gift and generosity of the giver. So the way Paul takes and transforms these ideas, or he gives a countercultural language to these already existing languages of grace, he does it in 4 ways. And I have them laid out here. And there's other scriptures, but these are just really the important ones. So first of all, God's giving is deeply self-sacrificing. And Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians. Well, while I'm looking for that, if you remember last video, I talked about God's love story being revealed in Jesus' story. And Paul gives us a concise story of Jesus in Philippians 2, his famous hymn hymn about Christ. And so he talks about God emptying himself, giving up of himself fully, right? He's equal with God, but gives that up and he becomes a servant, right? To the point, and he's obedient to the point of death. So he gives his life. So God gives, and he gives of himself, self-sacrificing. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." And so the same idea is there, right? He empties himself. He was rich. He was equal with God. That's probably as rich as could be. And he emptied himself. He became poor, self-sacrifice, so that we may be rich. Whereas the pagan giving is self-affirming and had no intention of impoverishing the giver. They gave from their abundance, their surplus. Their giving never hurt them. So this is the first way Paul's countercultural. The second way is God gives lavishly, or as John Barclay would say, super abundantly. And so this we could see in Romans 5:20. Chapter 5 is a really, really good chapter of Paul. But it's in his discourse about the 2 Adams. First Adam, second Adam, Christ. and how where there's trespass and I'll die in the first Adam, there's obedience and I'll live in the second Adam. And he talks about, so there's this dichotomy, but it's not equal. It's not symmetrical. It's actually asymmetrical. And so Paul says, where sin multiplies, grace multiplies even more, lavishly, super abundantly. So God gives and he gives fully. Whereas pagan grace was measured and limited, the benefactors kept tabs on their clients, right? I'll give you this, and they might even give lavishly, but it depends on the person, and we'll talk more in this next section about that. But they're giving dependent on what they can get back. So pagans might give lavishly, but only to specific types of people. God just gives lavishly, right? His giving is not limited, it's not measured, it's immeasurable, unlimited, and unimaginably abundant. So God gives, and he gives us everything. And then the third countercultural way of talking about grace is God graciously gives to those who are unworthy or seem to not deserve his gift. Like I just mentioned, pagans would give lavishly depending on the person, what they could get from that person. So usually an elite will lavishly gift another elite because that elite could probably lavishly gift them. If it's just Farmer Joe, he'll limit his gift because he knows Farmer Joe can't, or even if he tries to give him lavishly, it'll be like nothing compared to what he could give. So there's discrimination in the giving. With God, there's no discrimination. He is not partial. He gives to all. And Paul even says all are unworthy. No one is worthy of the gift of Christ. But God gives generously to all. Now, a caveat that needs to be put in this, and this is Barclay's point, is that grace, God's grace and gift, like all gifts, there is expectations of a response, a journey towards congruity. And so, like pagan relationships, patron-client, all gifts involved a condition, which is to say that if the condition isn't met, that relationship is breakable. If the appropriate response was not forthcoming, the relationship is terminated. Thus, the client would be shamed, remember honor shame culture, and his status ruined, his lifeline gone. In a sense, Paul is not being countercultural here, because grace, even God's grace, nevertheless has strong expectations of a comprehensive response. Gifts always come with grace, or with expectation, and God's gift of Jesus is no exception. So for example, there's always a response necessary. Paul says to the Corinthians, one of the naughtiest churches, he says in 6:9-11, do not be deceived. No sexually immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, or males who have sex with males, no thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, or swindlers will inherit God's kingdom. So there is you hear a conditioned language, right? There's all these no's, right? All these sins, sinful states don't inherit the kingdom. But here's the caveat. Verse 11, and some of you used to be like this. Remember, God gives to anyone, even the unworthy. And so there is an expectation of the gift, right? The whole point of listing all those no's is to warn them, hey, don't be like this. So that's a negative, right? To negate sin, but there's also positive expectation. Grace is supposed to elicit ethics and moral growth. God is not interested in inert covenant partners, right? Because when you accept the gift, you enter a relationship. This is the covenant, is an ongoing relationship. Those created in love and destined for love are called also to respond in love. Now I'm pulling out of not Paul, but it's a helpful summary of this idea. It comes from 1 John, the apostle of love, although so is Paul, so they're all apostles of love. But John summarizes it well, saying in chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4, "Dear friends, let us love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, because God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his one and only Son into the world so that we might live through him. Love consists in this, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning or reconciling sacrifice for our sins." And so there is an expectation. God is love. If you know God, you know love. And if you do love, you're known by love. And so there is an expectation, right? God gives graciously, self-sacrificing, lavishly to anyone, even the unworthy, because we're all unworthy. But there is an expectation, right? We're in covenant. You're called to do things. Think of all the prophets calling Israel to justice, to love, to mercy. But where Paul is countercultural, so like the pagan gift giving, the relationship starts. If it's not reciprocated, because the relationship is conditional from the get-go, it can be terminated. For God, nevertheless, God's gracious gift is covenantal, not contractual. Therefore, it is unconditional and irrevocable. God's relationship with us remains, if necessary, incongruous and unconditioned. Romans 11, again, just go read Romans. Fantastic. But Paul's talking about, and this is in reference to Israel, which is a good example, because that's where God initiates his covenant, is with Israel. And so he's wrestling with, well, if God's in covenant with Israel, he gave them a gift, he started this covenant relationship, so now what's happening? And he says in chapter 11, regarding the gospel, they are enemies for your advantage, the Gentiles' advantage. But regarding election, because right, God's relationship is elective, it's unconditional, it's irrevocable. So according to election, they are loved because of the patriarchs. Verse 29, since God's gracious gifts and calling are irrevocable. And so even if we don't respond, we receive the gift, we still start the covenant relationship, and God is faithful. That's the righteousness of God. His righteousness is known in his faithfulness to the covenant that he initiates. Because the way any of this is possible, again, because the foundation of it all is love, right? It's initiated by God's love. He initiates it. It's voluntary on his part. He gives the gift. He just, there you go. Jesus Christ, my son, died on the cross, resurrected for you. And it hurts. It hurt him. He died on the cross. It was huge. It covers everything. Where sin multiplies, grace multiplies more. And it's for all of you, because all of you are unworthy. There's an expectation, right? And it's more of a pleading, right? Because God's a father. He's Abba Father. We're adopted. And I don't see any, there's fathers are stern, but ultimately it's for the sake of pleading, right? A father just wants to see the best for their children. And so he wants the best when they respond in love, right? Because the response doesn't happen because of us. We don't start anything. But when we're known by love, all we should know is love. Right? To be known by God is to be known by love, and therefore to know love. To know how to love. This is reconciled, this should be. And so it's initiated by love. And this gift, right, it is embodied, it is concrete, right? Jesus wasn't an abstract thing. Jesus isn't an idea. He was a human being, Jesus of Nazareth. And he walked concretely, he touched people, he healed, he embraced, he showed what a gift he was. Concretely embodied, and he hung physically on a cross and died. And he was raised to life in flesh, embodied, concrete. And so our acts and practices as Jesus followers should be concrete and embodied. And in Paul's communities, they were. And I'll give some examples, and we don't have time to go through it. You could go through it on your own. But in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, right, that's giving and sharing food. There's a big money collection for the community back in Jerusalem for the poor that's initiated in Galatians 2:10. But you see this collection continuing and growing. 1 Corinthians 16:3-4, 2 Corinthians chapters 8-9, and in one of his later letters, Romans 15:25-28. There's a giving of resources throughout the community, 2 Corinthians 8:15. There's giving on behalf of another's financial burdens, even self-sacrificially. In Philemon, verse 19, Paul wants to pay off Onesimus, the slave who ran away, who has a heavy burden, a life debt, and Paul's willing to pay this off while in prison. So that's sacrificial for sure. And then there's giving of miracles, healings, spiritual things all throughout the early church, but you can see it in Acts 19 verses 11-12. So God initiates in love. The first thing he does with that love is he gives. He gives the ultimate gift, Jesus Christ. And through this gift, Jesus Christ, we see the gracious ultimate giver. And it's initiated by love. It's irrevocable. God gives the gift for the relationship, not to benefit from us, right? He doesn't need us. He just wants to enjoy us. And we'll talk a bit more about that in another section. But thank you for joining me. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, I don't know if I could answer everything, but we could try. Just email me at elvier@firstchristianchurch.org. Thank you for joining me today. Have a good day.